So, as I was saying, it's always great to introduce a professor, but a professor of disability studies all the better. And I know that professor of critical disability studies and psychology is quite a title, and quite a brave title in the climate that I'm aware of anyway. But it's so, it is so important that the professors in this field are recognised as professors of disability studies. I mean, that is part of the job that we have of consolidating disability studies. It isn't just in the work that we do, but it's getting that recognised at that faculty level that then is outward facing, as it were. But many of you don't need me to say that, as it were, but I'm just kind of sharing the joy in that. So we have with us a great example of that, a professor who's done a lot of work that's crossed many aspects of disability studies. I've certainly used it in my work, and I know lots of you used it in yours. And coming from Manchester Metropolitan University, which has done a lot of important stuff for disability studies, influenced myself and a lot of the decisions I've made along the way, certainly people from MMU. So I think rather than me kind of open that up more, we all know we're welcoming here, so if you can just show your appreciation for Professor Katherine Runswick-Cole.
Hello. I also have some large print copies, sadly not on Canadian paper. It's Derbyshire paper, and probably not as insightful as Canadian paper, but I do have some paper. So I wanted to start by thanking David and all the team for putting on the conference. I think that the more smooth running and more easily the conference goes, the less you think about the work that took to get people here. And I know from my own experience of conference organising that it's massive work. It's work that's not always recognised by the university, I think. So I'm very grateful to all the people who spent so much time in making it such a successful event. Now, when the email popped into my inbox inviting me to do this keynote, and I went, in the shared office that we have at Manchester Metropolitan University, I immediately replied to David and said, what was it that you were thinking I might talk about? And he said, stress intersectionality on some level. So that's what I'm going to try and do by thinking about critical disability studies, feminist theory, studies of childhood and parenting, to think again about mothering. Now, as some of you know, the last 18 months have been quite mixed for me. So my experiences of health, illness, disability, mothering and being mothered have been in flux. And I think that if you go through a period of change, that sometimes prompts a moment of reflection. So I want to take time to look back at some of the work that I've done, some thinking that we've done, and to look forward to think through childhood and mothering. Now, many of the ideas in this paper are also to be found in an about-to-be-published book chapter written with Dan Goodley. So if you like this presentation, please tell me. If you don't like it, then please contact him at d.goodley@sheffield.ac.uk. And on the screen there's a picture of the handbook that it's about to be published in. And this links really with what Robert was talking about yesterday, because there are lots of gingerbread figures, very colourful stitched gingerbread figures, which are on the book cover. And that, as many of you will know, links to the Justice for LB campaign. So Connor was a young man who died 4 years ago. He was left in a bath. He had epilepsy and a learning disability, and he drowned. His death, they tried to pass it off really quickly as sudden death and epilepsy and nothing to see her move along. And because that happened, Connor's family fought very bravely. And in the end, there was an investigation into all the uninvestigated deaths of people with learning disabilities in that health trust. And it was found that fewer than 1% of unexpected deaths of people with learning disabilities were investigated. So those gingerbread figures represent each of those diverse, varied, valued, loved lives through having these beautiful stitch figures. So it's been described as craftivism, which I really like. So that's what's on there, on the book cover. Now, when I told my daughter that Dan and I were writing a chapter about mothering, she was indignant, and she said, Dan can't write about mothering, he's not a mother. Now, in a way, Imogen's right. It's still women who are expected to take on the responsibility for care, and this is especially the case for mothers of disabled children like me. But at the same time, it's important to acknowledge the complexities of the mothering role, and that some fathers, as Patty Douglas would say, do mother. We need to think about mothers and others. While it's important to recognise that we all have a relationship to mothering and that we all have something to contribute to the debates about mothering that are raging in contemporary neoliberal societies, and this even includes Dan. And now there's an image on the screen, which is Dan Goodley wearing a blonde wig, a pink tutu, stockings, and holding a very beautiful podgy baby. So even Dan gets to talk about this stuff, I think. So in 2008, Sarah Ryan, Conor Sparrowhawk's mother, and I were very, very early career researchers, and both mothers of disabled children. And we were struggling with what it meant to be non-disabled mothers of disabled children working in disability studies, as well as making sense of our status in our everyday lives. And here I want to revisit some of the questions we raised in a paper published in 2008, but also try and look forward. And I want to apply a critical disability studies lens to think not only about mothering disabled children, but how disability might allow us to reimagine mothering in ways that offer different and more affirmative possibilities for mothers and others and disabled children. Now, as we heard yesterday, this discussion is taking place in a time of economic downturn, cuts to welfare, and austerity measures, and a great deal of global uncertainty. And I want to pay attention to what has been described as the requirements of austerity parenting, to explore the increasing expectations put on all mothers in these neoliberal able times. So then, drawing on a historical and geographical critique of global north models of mothering, I want to try and disrupt this austerity parenting narrative by affirming interdependence and community in children and families' lives, and by exposing and rejecting the individualizing practices of the neoliberalisation of the family. And finally, I will invoke the disability commons as a collective and affirmative alternative approach to individualising models of parenting that oppress both mothers and others and disabled children. I apologise in advance for the gratuitous use of images of David Cameron, which I will not be describing. I do have some pictures, and where they're necessary for me, I'll describe them, and I'll say all the words on the slide. So back in 2012, Cameron said, so if we want to have any hope of mending our broken society, family and parenting is where we've got to start. And so in the UK, the good parenting is a central plank of public policy discourse and popular culture. It's constructed as the primary route for securing good outcomes for children. More so, good parenting has taken on a wider social significance, as it is represented by government as the route through which broken Britain, as Cameron described it, will be mended. The coalition government enthusiastically embraced the good parenting mantra that emerged during the new Labour administration. In contemporary England, good parenting is touted as a crucial means of increasing both social mobility and social inclusion. It's tied to discourses of cost effectiveness, with the view that early intervention in children's lives will save the state money in the future. Parenting pedagogy programmes have become the preferred mechanism for intervention. We all need them, by the way. Even middle-class parents need them there. And the government believes that it's crucial for all parents to learn to parent well. Now, this is happening at the same time as there's been a rise in what's been described as brain-based understandings of child development, and they've been used to shore up this policy shift. So brain-based models take as their starting point the contestable assertion that the early years are the most important in a person's life because they play a crucial and irreversible role in the child's emotional and cognitive development. Early intervention is then not just justified, but also vital for the child's development and for the good of wider society. As the feminist scholar Bev Skeggs reminds us, capitalism seeps into the everyday, and parenting has become the site where, quote, everybody is expected to display themselves as a source of worth, end quote. The rise of the neurocultural discourse has been seized upon as providing a scientific basis for capitalist demands of good parenting. The illusion of parenting and brain development classically psychologise policy narratives and associated interventions. Above all, 21st century parenting has been reimagined as an individualised task. And on the screen there's a picture of Bernie Sanders, David Cameron and Ed Miliband, and they're all with text that talks about hard-working families. So it's shifted this real focus on the idea that we're going to look after hard-working families, which is quite interesting because it's not we're going to help the poorest and most needy in society. We're not going to help the people not in work, we're going to help the people in work, so there's been a shift. But it's interesting that when I found Bernie Sanders, so left, right, well leftish, right, us saying the same things, buying into the same narratives. Okay. So Gillies describes this neoliberalisation of the family. Through individualising parenting, families and children emerge as the site of the problem, intervention and blame. While the neoliberal language of parent masks the gendered aspects of parenting, it is still mothers or maternal figures who are expected to take on the majority of responsibility for care. Lone working class mothers in particular are held to account for a host of societal ills, from juvenile delinquency to societal collapse. Mothers are blamed for a series of wrong choices for their children and of breaking the new sexual contract in which women are expected simultaneously to labour, consume and mother and care. The neoliberalisation and psychologisation of the family demands individual self-governance and willfully obscures the role that contemporary political and societal structures play in family life. When socio-economic inequalities are sidelined, Jensen argues that good parenting is confined to the realm of culture and aspiration. Crucially, in the context of economic downturn, the expectation is that good mothers will engage in labour as well as taking primary responsibility for care to ensure that their children do not financially or socially burden the state. So, what do these requirements of austerity parenting mean for mothers of disabled children, especially in a time of psychologisation and neoliberal ableism? In the austere times, as we've seen, all mothers are made precarious in bearing responsibility for labour and care. Benedictus rightly pays attention to the class nature of good parenting and the vilification of working class single mothers, but precarity is differentially rather than equally spread, and lone or solitary working class mothers are certainly made more precarious than other mothers in the good parenting discourse, as Tyler's discussion of chav mum, chav scum startlingly illustrates. But here we want to say that mothers of disabled children also emerge as differentially precarious, although we do so without wishing to deny the impact of the intersectional relationships between class, gender, race and disability in their lives. Mothers of disabled children are sometimes disabled people too, and that disabled motherhood, regardless of the disability status of the child, is inevitably seen as an always irresponsible / risky / more costly, burdensome thing for the state. And these issues are articulated by disabled feminist writers like Freya Haroldsdottir and Jo Skitterall. Mothers of disabled children are made more precarious because while austerity parenting requires mothers to produce children who are neither a financial or social burden on the state, mothers are regarded as having produced children whose very embodiment represents both the present and future drain on the resources of the state and on the healthy functioning of the family and society. There's a two-pronged rhetoric of early intervention into the realm of deficit of lack, and also as them being a drain on finite resources now and in the future. Accounts of the disabled child mother dyad are characterised through a narrative of negative reciprocity. So bad mothering threatens child development, while the presence of the disabled child threatens the mother and wider family's well-being, as the mother learns to adjust to the loss associated with mothering a disabled child. The rise of psychological norms of child development in the last century, accompanied by a shift as the site of intervention from the child to the mother, positions both disabled children and their mothers as a problem that must be subjected to constant monitoring and surveillance. So at the same time, austerity parenting requires mothers to engage in paid labour as well as taking on primary responsibility for care. And yet mothers of disabled children are so often confined throughout their working lives to piecemeal and unsatisfactory employment patterns. A lack of affordable and accessible childcare means that only 16% of mothers of disabled children are in paid work, compared with 61% of mothers of non-disabled children. So in a context of austerity, more than ever, mothers and disabled children are represented as a financial burden to the state, and conversely expected to take on the dual roles of worker and carer, roles which, of course, are often underpaid and undervalued. So on the screen now there's a lot of self-help books. I just want to talk about the first one, which is called Mothering Special Needs, and the absence of the word children. So, not even a child, you're just a special need, I bet. So Jensen notes that austerity parenting has led to a rise in the self-help movement that supports all parents in raising happy, confident children. But good mothers of disabled children in particular must be seen to bow to the demands of the side professions. They must invest in the promise of therapeutic interventions that will move their child ever closer to the elusive norm. Good mothers of disabled children become producers and consumers of sign knowledge in their quest for the norm. Yet again, the roles of the mother of disabled child are expanded. They are to work, consume, care as good citizens, and anticipate, utilise and enact a whole plethora of specialist early interventions, which are increasingly neurological and psychological in character. The search for the norm is tied to the view that a disabled child is in need of intervention and cure. An acceptance of this view by mothers seems to promise a route out of the precarious position they found themselves in. By adopting a traditional sick role for their child and by seeking diagnostic labels and interventions, they hope to locate the problem within the individual brains and bodies of the child and by implication outside the mother-child relationship. Understandably, mothers of disabled children aspire to escape their designation as incapable parents, or worse still perhaps chav mums. However, a promise of a less precarious life is nothing more than cruel optimism. Ballant describes cruel optimism as the persistent attachment that we have to a belief in the power of the market to liberate us. Belief in the power of medicine and diagnostic labels seems to offer a route of liberation from the categorisation of bad mother. But to accept the child's disorder also means accepting handicap, social stigma, dependence, isolation and economic disadvantage, because it's only then that a state of exception can be granted and the mother can benefit and child can benefit from the redistributive practices of the welfare state. They become the worthy poor. The cruelty is that the price paid for escaping maternal blame is acceptance of psychological difference and pathological disorder, and a devalued and stigmatised identity for the child. Worse still, the promise of absolution for the mother from blame for the child's difference is often unfulfilled, as mothers of disabled children are still held to account for their children's development and behaviour, no matter their impairment status. Mothers, after all, are the key agents of change for their kids in these times of austerity. So above I described how the mother must accept her disabled child's stigmatised identity as different and disordered to be granted this state of exception. In what follows, I further explore the complex relationship of mothers of disabled children and their experiences in relation to the notions of sameness and difference. I want to return to a question that Sarah and I mentioned in that first paper: is mothering a disabled child the same as or different from other mothering? For Gregory, mothering a disabled child is to be different. She talks about a mother because she undoubtedly has a child, yet somehow not a mother in terms of the conventional notions of motherhood that pervade our society. Greenspan describes mothering a disabled child as parenting without a developmental map, and that mothers of disabled children are offered often competing and conflicting advice on how properly to parent their child. So it's worth pausing for a moment here to ask the question, why is this question of whether a disabled child is the same or different, parenting a disabled child is the same or different from parenting a non-disabled child so important? Why has it drawn so much discussion? It seems to me that this question matters because being same as or different from other mothers and children has real consequences in families' lives. All parents are under increasing pressure. If mothering a disabled child is the same as mothering a non-disabled child, then the requirement to raise a child who neither socially nor economically burdens the state is the same, and mothers of disabled children must care and labour in the same way as other mothers of non-disabled children and vice versa. However, if mothers of disabled children assert their difference by claiming their child's disorder through the practices of labelling and pathologisation, then they may hope that the neoliberal state will redistribute resources to them. And yet, as we saw above, claiming difference is a risky strategy. It positions the child on the margins. They become the not quite the same as non-disabled children. Being same but not quite means that disabled children occupy a borderlands position and are not offered or expected to have the experiences and opportunities of non-disabled children. Indeed, their play is categorised as disordered, they're excluded from leisure opportunities, from mainstream education, and as young people are denied opportunities for employment support. At worst, they become so dehumanised that they experience neglect, violence, and even death. There's a host of literature that documents the campaigns of mothers of disabled children to challenge these multiple exclusions and to advocate for support and services for their disabled children. Crucially, these campaigns depend on the mother's claims that the disabled children are both simultaneously same as and different from other children. So, for example, a mother might argue that her child has a right to education because of her status as a child, same, under the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, and yet she might simultaneously claim that her child has the right to additional resources and adaptations in education precisely because she is a disabled child or different. So, this position of claiming difference and sameness at the same time is one that we've discussed elsewhere as a dishuman reality, one which we contend simultaneously acknowledges the possibilities offered by disability to trouble, reshape and refashion traditional conceptions of the human, to diss typical understandings of personhood, while simultaneously asserting disabled people's humanity to assert normative, often traditional understandings of personhood. A dishuman position allows us to reflect on the conflict inherent in claiming sameness and difference in disabled children's lives. We also see our exploration of this human as an opportunity to recognise and to celebrate the ways in which disabled children positively disrupt, reframe and expand what it means to be normal. As Bradotti reminds us, the human norm stands for normality, normalcy and normativity, and yet disabled children demand us to rethink the norm in the context of play, school, families and intimate lives, and in doing so they demand us to rethink notions of what it means to be human. Here we might add that a dishuman position has the potential to disrupt normative notions of mothering. For instance, we have seen that disabled children demand dismothering by paying attention to the ways in which mother and child can be both same as and different from the norm at the same time, and by demanding sameness in their rights to education, health and leisure, while demanding to be treated differently in their quest to be treated equally. However, thus far we've left the assumption that the mother-child dyad should be the focus of the discussion and debate intact. So despite a rise in a sort of corrective approach that emphasised the positive or implicitly the negative aspects of mothering disabled children, there is a danger that even this positive focus on the mother-child relationship merely reinforces the idea that mothering is naturally a woman's role and responsibility. There is need for a radical reappraisal of the wider social context in which austerity parenting is currently taking place, and the possibilities of exploring the positive ways in which disabled children disrupt normative notions of mothering. So I want to explore the possibilities for an approach of resistance offered by decentering attention away from the mother-child dyad. A seemingly natural preoccupation with the mother-child dyad in parenting practice and policy in England masks its emergence as both a temporally and geographically located phenomenon. During the 19th century, state surveillance and control increased alongside the rise of the professions and the identification of deviancy. It wasn't until 1924 that Piaget identified the normal stages of childhood cognition, thereby enabling the identification of abnormal or delayed cognitive development. While not holding Piaget individually responsible, although I might quite like to, his influence on the rise of developmental psychology ensured that the role of mother was emphasised as a primary factor in models of child development. So theorists, including Anna Freud and Melanie Klein, began to describe mothering as the key to a child's psychic and development and personality. At the same time, mothercraft manuals were teaching mothers their roles and responsibilities in ensuring their child's typical development. So Harriet Cooper cites Lydiard, and not that one, not Kirsty Lydiard, a different Lydiard, writing in 1924, which I don't think Kirsty was doing. So 1924 Lydiard says, "Every child is an individual and develops along individual lines, but it is well for the mother to know the average so that they may recognise any large departure and be able to get proper advice." The taken for granted importance of the mother-child relationship in child-rearing practices emerges as a peculiarly 20th century and 21st century phenomenon. So such preoccupations are geographically as well as historically located. While contemporary austerity parenting narratives in the global north seek to individualise parenting, Tsitsi Chitaka and Judy Mackenzie remind us that many African cultures continue to value family and community more than individual differences or human attributes. They describe the notion of Ubuntu. Whatever happens to the individual happens to the group, and whatever happens to the whole group happens to the individual. The individual can only say, "I am because we are, and since we are, therefore I am." In sharp contrast to the focus on the mother-child dyad in the global north, in many global south cultures, it is the extended family that provides for a child, highlighting the deep significance of being part of a whole. For some children, we could argue that there are many mothers. Being part of a whole is not, however, just a global south phenomenon. In Revolting Subjects, Social Objection and Resistance in Neoliberal Britain by Imogen Tyler, which if anyone hasn't read, you really must read, Imogen Tyler offers a harrowing account of the protests of a group of mothers at the Yarlswood Immigration Removal Centre in Bedfordshire. So this is where failed asylum seekers are sent before they're sent back to their country of origin. Tyler describes the protests that followed when a young Burundian mother was separated from her 60-year-old son and placed in solitary confinement. The other mother detainees demanded to know what had happened to the mother and to the child. In the protests that followed, the mothers stripped bare, engaging in a naked protest in a deliberate impersonation of their dehumanisation. Through their collective protest, the mothers were seeking to resist their constitution as wasted humans. The mothers faced huge challenges, and yet they were able to engage in resistant acts and to demonstrate their collective agency. This coming together has been described by Tyler as the maternal commons. While Tyler's discussion of the maternal commons emerges from the lives of mothers seeking asylum in England, we also see moments where the maternal commons emerges in the lives of mothers and their disabled children. And that takes us back to where I began, really, and what happened with the Justice for LB campaign. So when Connor died, it became a real impetus for a campaign for change. And there was a whole group of people, a lot of it was done on Twitter, there was great campaigning around that led to a campaign called 107 Days of Action. You could go and have a look at the tweets are still there. Now, doing that campaigning, there were during the campaign there were blogs, there were academic presentations, there were sponsored events, there was more craftivism, there's a quilt, I'll show you a picture of the quilt at the end, and fundraisers for the family's legal fees so that Connor's family could be represented in his inquest. And since then, other campaigns have highlighted the deaths of young people with learning disabilities in care. And they've also used this kind of approach of bringing people together. So I'm thinking particularly about Nico Reed and Thomas Rawnsley, though sadly there are lots of other people I could have spoken about too. And what the Justice for LB campaign did, and these other campaigns, is demand us to think again about how we value and treat young people and how we understand our shared humanity whilst valuing human diversity and difference. The campaign might also be seen to demand us to think again about the pressures that global North cultures put on mothers as carers, labourers and campaigners for their disabled children. The campaign offer an alternative response through a coming together as Imogen Tyler described it, the commons. So while many of the Justice for LB campaigners are mothers of disabled children, the campaign has drawn support from a range of people: men, women, disabled people, parents, siblings, activists, and those allied to disability politics. So we've tried to describe this form of campaigning as the disability commons. Such campaigns are formed through a recognition of common humanity and interdependence. They fly in the face of neoliberal ableisation of the family, a lens through which such tragedies might only be constructed as individualised private troubles for mothers of disabled children. Through the engagement of the disability commons, such private troubles have become public matters, with the Justice for LB campaign demanding a change in the law that's, so that disabled people have the right to live in their communities. And I just want to talk briefly, go off script for a moment, to say please also have a look at hashtag 7 Days of Action, because last week there was a campaign about moving people with learning disabilities out of assessment and treatment units. The campaign was extremely successful. There were 18 million impressions on Twitter. There were 2 short sections on the BBC Breakfast programme, drawing attention to the fact that people with learning disabilities are treated as commodities in the care system, referred to as imports and exports, and that if you spend 5 years in an assessment and treatment unit, you will generate £950,000 worth of income, and a substantial amount of that will be profit. So Stephanie Binchcliffe, who was in an assessment and treatment unit, I think for 10 years, died of sleep apnea because she put on lots of weight, and no one did anything about that. She'd been in a room for that time. The cost of that so-called care was £13,500 a week. So you have to ask yourself, what's going on here? Because people are making money out of the lives of people with learning disabilities. I saw this morning that another plan for a huge hospital for people labelled with autism. I don't even begin to understand what that could mean, actually. But people are making masses of money out of this, as they described it, a trade in people. So please do go and have a look at that. But it's yet another example of collective activism, really, really powerful collective activism, and gives us reason, I think, to be hopeful about change. And I want to give a little bit of hope here as well. Actually, just go back. So, just to talk very briefly about a project that I did with Dan Foodley, Rebecca Lawtham, Toby Brandon, Val Williams, also with Speak Up Self Advocacy, a whole load of people. But we had a project called Big Society. So back to David Cameron again, no more gratuitous images. And what did Big Society mean for people with learning disabilities? And we tried to document the moments where we saw the disability commons emerging, thankfully, in more positive and less tragic circumstances than I've spoken about already. So I just want to give you an example. So Henry is an 18-year-old man with a label of learning disabilities. He's going through what's known as transition in the English education policy as he moves from children's services in education, health and social care to adult services. At this time, young people with learning disabilities and their families have to navigate complex service systems and negotiate new support packages. Working with a circle of support made up of Henry, a facilitator, friends and family members, including his mother and father. So this circle met regularly to help plan for this future. The circle created a one-page profile to share with people working with him, as well as developing a weekly plan, including college and work experience. So having supported Henry in his transition beyond school, the next steps are for to move Henry into paid employment. So whereas previously the family were doing this on their own, they've now got it's like a research management group meeting. They've got a whole load of expertise, whole load of connections, and it's one of those things that kind of spreads out, so that somebody knows somebody, who knows somebody, who knows somebody, and that's how we make connections in our lives. And some people just need a little bit more help and structure maybe to do that. So the circle can be seen to represent the disability commons in Henry's life. Rather than the responsibility for care and for planning for the future for her son resting with his mother alone, it's now a shared responsibility. Now, we don't want to overstate the case here. Henry's mother plays a key role in the circle. She still takes the role of meeting practitioners, attending meetings and filling in forms, and she is the one that's held to account for her son's behaviour and development by professionals. But the disability commons that she's part of, formed around her son, allows her to experience some moments where it's possible to de-individualise parenting and to share responsibility. Nearly there. So, in austere times, mothers of disabled children bear the responsibility more than ever for their children's care. The mother-child relationship continues to be the central site of surveillance of deviancy and for the practice of therapeutic intervention in the 21st century. The appeal to neuroscience has confirmed the 20th century view that the quality of mother-child interactions is vital for early childhood development and for a healthy state. Mothers are being held to account for the future development of good citizens as the socio-economic conditions in which parenting takes place are ignored. Mothers of disabled children find themselves differentially precarious as their children have come to represent both the present and future danger to scarce state resources in times of austerity. In order to benefit from the redistributive policies of neoliberalism, mothers of disabled children must accept their children's stigmatised identities. However, we think that it might be possible to resist and to revise the dominating austerity parenting narrative. First, by exposing its historical and geographical location, and secondly, by appealing to more interdependent and collectivist models of child rearing that do not simply reinforce the oppressive individualizing practices of austerity parenting and the side disciplines. Through a recognition of our common humanity, whilst valuing human diversity and difference, when the disability commons emerges, it becomes possible to move beyond the oppressive limits of the focus on the mother-child dyad and to celebrate the interdependencies in all our lives. Thank you.
Okay, we have got time for a few questions, if that's okay with you.
Where's the microphone? Okay. Yeah, I'm happy to take.
Okay.
There are.
Any questions?
This is Robert McClure, and this is maybe more of a comment than a question. I really enjoyed the talk, and I just am struck by this notion of the disability commons because of the ways in which certain narratives have sedimented using metaphors of disability. So that idea that the problem is always sort of individualized bad behavior and not class division or whatever, is so sedimented over the last 3 decades or so. And in the UK, it's sedimented around that Cameronian idea of broken Britain. Mm-hmm. And now in the US, crippled America. So disability is sort of metaphorized and weaponized to put that narrative upon us. And so I love the ways in which the disability commons sort of speaks back to that, quite negative use of disability to keep us apart from each other.
Thank you. Thank you. I think it's so important that, that we try and come up with some kind of more positive response, because we spend a lot of time documenting horrible, horrible things. And I think we need to come up with steps forward and to celebrate, as you did in your work yesterday, to celebrate those moments of resistance, to celebrate that activism, to promote that activism, to share that activism. I think my concern is about who's included in that activism, because as many people know, I have my complete love of Twitter, and I realise how inaccessible that is to so many people for so many reasons. And I think we have to work harder about a more inclusive disability activism. But we can't just carry on documenting this stuff. We have to say something else, I think.
Thank you. I was thinking about the maternal commons and how it's there, but it's not seen. So in the sort of public discourses of motherhood, whether it's popular or whatever, other mothers are seen as potential threats. They're seen as rivals or as people who might criticise you or ostracise you. And of course, these things happen. They happen between all human beings. But actually, just from personal experience and having been a child and then having brought one up, there is a general feeling of concern for each other's kids, but there's no acknowledgement of it. So if you're worried about someone else's child, then there's no way you can go without, if you don't want to stigmatise the parent. There's no way of expressing that concern. And I think especially if a child has special needs and the mother's then becomes some kind of unpaid expert for that child, it increases their isolation, because the idea is, well, you can't go near this child without training them.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I completely agree with that and have experienced that. And I think I've been very privileged because I work in disability studies that I've been able to bring a commons around me that includes parents of disabled children, parents but not of disabled children. And I recognise that privilege, and I wish it was an experience that other people had access to, and that we need to find ways of bringing people together. But to go back to Twitter, and I know this doesn't include everybody, there are some amazing groups of usually mothers of disabled children who are supporting one another over vast differences, who don't know each other but have this shared experience. And they are doing some amazing work, challenging pathologisation, challenging the discrimination that their children face. So there are moments of optimism, but yeah, I understand.
Can I just ask you to identify yourself? Sorry.
Sorry. Oh, me?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I'm Joanne Lindberg, I apologise.
Okay, no problem. And just if I can just remind everyone, just partly for those of us who can't see you, but also for those of us who don't know you, perhaps who've joined today, so it just helps everyone. Which is beautiful, isn't it?
Interdependent.
Thank you for laughing at one of my jokes.
So on that, I'm a master's student here at Liverpool. I'm doing my master's dissertation based on the experiences of mothers in the education system at the moment. I'm in the kind of very early stages of analysis right now, but the main thing coming out for me is this sort of attitudinal barrier between parents and professionals, where parents have to become pseudo-professionals, but the professionals have an attitude that parents don't understand their role either, and that seems to be, for me, the main kind of barrier to education for children. So I was just
Well, I think I must be I've tried really, really hard to become a professional. I've become a professor in the hope that my view might be taken seriously by the professionals working with my son, and it's made absolutely no difference whatsoever. When my son was in sixth form, there were members of the staff team who were doing a course at Sheffield Hallam where they were forced to read my work. It made no difference to how they viewed what I had to say. I really don't think that you should have to professionalise to be listened to. I think it's really, really important to recognise that the reason why you should listen to me and to my partner and to my son's sister is because of our relationships to them, and this requirement to professionalise yourself and to adopt the language and the knowledge. And when my kids were little, I wasn't working full time, and if I had a multi-professional meeting, I'd always turn up at the school gates as if I looked as if I just nipped out of the office, because I felt it was a way of me trying to say, I'm very, I'm like you, I am the same as you. But it never worked. You can mimic them, but they won't let you in. So you need to give that up and then just go for the activist route, and then they don't like that either, but at least you feel happy with who you are.
Hi, I'm Alicia Broderick. I'm from the States, from New Jersey, and I have a question that's probably fairly self-serving, so I apologize for that. But I'm really interested in this overlap that you're talking about with the maternal commons and the disability commons, and the need, as you said, to conceptualize learning, development, growth, parenting, living in the world in more collectivist ways, rather than the individualized, which takes you down that path toward pathologization and expertism, as we talked about. So my family, our son homeschools, and he has been doing so for 6 or 7 years now. And one thing that I have found in the States, anyway, at least where I am, is that there's this. I was seeking sort of that maternal parental commons of people who are sort of opting out of particular ways of parenting and are looking to be more autonomous in that. And that's kind of what I was expecting going in. But what I was not anticipating, and I found and has been joyous, is this sort of disability commons that's existing outside of formal schooling, and it consists of both people who are not subjecting their kids to formal schooling in the first place, as well as families who are pulling their children out under conditions of some duress and almost as refugees. So I'm wondering, because I'm not all familiar with the homeschooling, outschooling, preschooling, deschooling, things going on in the UK, is there some similarity there in terms of what these communities that you're talking about around parenting and schooling?
Yeah, so there was something published last week which was talking about the numbers of children with special educational needs labels disappearing from schooling. So they're being pushed out. So these aren't parents who have a philosophical idea that they would like to homeschool. They're parents whose children are not fitting the system in some way or other. So there's been a big rise in homeschooling of children, and although I don't think there are official statistics, I think we can reasonably guess that lots of those children would be labelled. And I came across a podcast recently from the States on unschooling, and there was a discussion of it really crystallised for me the way that education requires labels, and that as soon as you stand outside of education they become redundant and you lose them. But it takes you back to the intersectional relationship between class and gender and race and so on, because who can afford to stay at home with their kids? Who has got those resources? So it shouldn't be that children are pushed out of education because of their SEN labels. Fine if people want to make that choice, they've made a free choice, but for many parents of disabled children it's not a free choice, it's the result of being pushed by a system that is so brutal. And actually for other children, any child who fails to conform closely enough to that mythical norm is in danger of being excluded from the school system. And I think also for some children, labels do operate as a label of forgiveness. So, there is more of an accommodation made, but it will be children that are not quite, not quite in the category of SEN, not quite in the category of normal. Those children seem to me to be the most vulnerable children to be pushed out of the education system.
Just one more, if that's okay, folks.
Sorry, Lisa Rappagalli, I just wanted to respond to that, if it's okay, because we homeschooled one of our children for a bit, and in the UK, it is very much area dependent, so it depends on where you live, and where we live is kind of semi-ruralish and has, not where I live, but just over there, sort of some quite posh, it encapsulates the Hebden Bridge bunch. So
I don't know if that translates nationally, the Hebden Bridge by the show, I don't know.
It encapsulates the Hebden Bridge bunch. So there's a lot of parents who ideologically choose to do that because their children don't necessarily fit in. So there is quite a strong network of support for children outside. But what is really interesting is as soon as the local authority found out that my background was teaching and that I was doing a PhD and all of this, all of a sudden nobody came near. And up until that point, it had been weekly phone calls, appointments coming through for us to take him to a centre, for him to have health checks, and then we just suddenly went off the system completely. So you talk about class and monitoring. I know quite well from some of the other parents, if they didn't have that background and those qualifications, then that's not their experience. Their experience is quite scrutinised, quite what curriculum are you doing? You send a teacher out who will then create a formal curriculum with them that they must follow and they must evidence in some way. Whereas I went, no, we're not doing that. So they went, oh right, okay then, and stepped back. Quite interesting.
Okay, well, thank you, folks. That was excellent. I'm sure we'd all like to show our appreciation.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you.